Welcome to Independence, the FIEC podcast. My name's Phil Topham, Executive Director of the FIEC, and it's time for In the News, our regular look at what's been happening in the news this week. And that voice was Adrian Reynolds, our Head of National Ministries.
See, I'm excited about the news. I do like the news, Phil.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
Very good to see you, Adrian. John Stevens is with us as well, our National Director. Good morning to you, John. Well, the first thing to start with, the most important news of the week is that Bolton Wanderers are going to Wembley. So there we are. The Papa John's Trophy final in early April. Will you be there, John? No, Adrian?
Well, I did say I would come with you.
Yeah.
But sadly, I'm at Word Alive.
It clashes with Word Alive. Bolton versus Plymouth, no less. There we are. That's the big news of the week. The Papa John's Trophy final. Other pizza is available. Seriously, the big news that's dominated the last couple of weeks has been the resignation of Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister of Scotland, and then, of course, the resulting leadership context, which has got a huge kind of Christian element to it. First of all,
so is it worth saying that it's dominated the political news? So there's obviously been serious earthquake around the world, ongoing war. So
which we did talk about a fortnight ago. To be fair, so I'm not minimising that, but I think that has dominated politics, hasn't it, for this last couple of weeks?
Domestic news.
First of all, what did we make of Nicola Sturgeon's resignation? It was a great surprise. It certainly was to me. Did you feel that as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's different. I find it quite. I find when I watch things like that, I'm immediately thinking, what's the story behind the story? And maybe that's just because I am a bit of a conspiracy theorist at heart, as we all are. We've talked about that before. But I'm thinking, is it just that she's burnt? I mean, she does appear to be burnt out and had enough and bruised and battered. Although she seems to have given some of that bruising and battering herself to others. But there we are. Is it just that, or is it an acceptance actually that she thinks actually we're not going to win the next election, we're not going to get our independence through, we're not going to win the court case against the UK government? So there's a bit of speculation about what's going on, but for good or ill, she has resigned, and it's worth watching her speech, I think, because it is extraordinary in that it kind of is a political speech, but it does end up all being about her, I thought. Did you think that, John? I did think it was quite self-centred, and there is something in that, that when your leadership style becomes about me, as it appears to be here, who knows what's really going on under the surface. I think that's a very dangerous place to be, isn't it? But that's certainly how I read it.
Yeah, when I watched it, I thought it came as a shocker surprise. I mean, she's been a dominant figure in British politics and in Scottish politics for a long period of time. So I don't think I was particularly expecting that. Although I think one thing that's been exposed is the challenge of leading a party that really has one mission, which is to bring about independence in Scotland, but then becomes the government and then has to make decisions across a whole spectrum of policies. And one of the challenges for the SNP, I think, in government is it a progressive party? Is it a conservative party? So
and a coalition government as well. It's not ruling on its own, is it?
With the Greens. And that's been exposed, I think. So obviously her position became vulnerable over all the confusion over gender recognition, particularly over the issue of the kind of the rapist and whether they should be in a male prison or a female prison, self-identification. And that exposed kind of, in a sense, her convictions about a sort of progressive liberal agenda, which aren't necessarily shared by the SNP more widely. It's easy to forget that actually the origins of the SNP were more with people from a conservative disposition who wanted a kind of an independence for Scotland. So there's obviously been challenges in terms of what direction the SNP should take, and that's being exposed in the current kind of election for a successor. There's also that sense in which actually the kind of progress towards independence in Scotland seems to some extent to have stalled. All of the polls suggest that there's been very little progress towards a majority in favour of independence since the vote in 2014. So I think it was 45% then, it's around about 46% now. And there just isn't any indication of a settled will on the Scottish people that they're wanting to go for kind of independence despite Brexit, despite kind of other things, despite many years of Conservative government in Westminster. So, at one level, it's kind of slightly pushing water uphill, it seems, at the moment.
Well, no, it's still a significant proportion, isn't it? 40, whatever, 5-6%. I mean,
you're not far off.
You'd still say on that basis that represents a very divided political scene.
Indeed, but we're really talking about why she stepped aside. And at one level, you've given much of your life to that. There seemed to be an indication that she wants to do other things in politics and have other concerns that she wants to pursue. So maybe there's just an understandable sense of that. But I did think it was a remarkable sort of resignation statement. I watched it live of her talking about herself. It was very self-focused. And again, what struck me was this kind of complaining about the nature of politics and how brutal it is. And actually, she's been part of that process and has now been hurt by it. But comments she's made about conservatives, about others, about other groups, about those who don't support independence, she's been perfectly happy to engage in that kind of political debate. And it has come back to kind of burn her. And I wonder whether on all of those things, there are elements in which kind of we can learn from church leadership. So there's always the danger of pursuing a single agenda. So as Christian leaders, we often have to speak across a whole spectrum of kind of different issues. We can't just simply choose one thing. And actually leaders who do make one thing, one focus, the central point of their ministry, often that becomes unbalanced in the end. And we can't engage in kind of critiquing others and engage in a kind of a rumbustious kind of approach and then not expect to feel the consequences of that ourselves. Biblical principle, treat others as you wish to be treated.
And then, of course, that's led to a massive leadership campaign being launched. And as soon as Nicola Sturgeon announced her resignation, people were questioning whether Kate Forbes, who's a member of the Free Church of Scotland, who we're in partnership with in Affinity as a constituent member, whether she would step up and put her hat into the ring for the leadership. She very quickly did. And what has followed has been basically she's been vilified in the media.
It's worth just setting some context, isn't it? She is already a senior minister.
Yeah, with the finance package.
In the finance, she's the finance minister, although she's on maternity leave currently.
And we're saying done an excellent job at that at quite short notice.
Had to step in following another scandal. She's been her ministry there has been very well received. So actually, we'll get on to talk about, won't we, about Christians in politics. But it's worth remembering that she has been a Christian in politics for some time and seems to have performed at a very high level and done extremely well. But yes, it is extraordinary to see the knives that have been out for her because of a number of positions she takes or the Free Church of Scotland takes, and she's assumed to have. And actually, she's been very straight and confirmed what she thinks about these various things.
Well, she's just been honest.
Yeah, she has. And she said she wants to be honest. She wants to act with integrity. She doesn't want to dodge the bullets. And that's just riled a lot of people.
Is it not ridiculous, though, in politics, that people can say on the one hand, you're entitled to your personal views as long as you don't express them. And then when people are honest about their personal views, they say, oh, you shouldn't perhaps have been honest about that. Yeah. We want integrity, but we don't at the same time.
It's the intolerance of tolerance, isn't it? Yeah. That actually... the people who pretend or purport to be very tolerant of other views actually end up being very intolerant of people that don't share their own particular views. And that's a dynamic that's been understood, I think, for some time.
I think one of the challenges that the problem here is the whole idea of having personal views. So sort of this idea that you can separate somehow your personal views from kind of politics. And I think that's something of a conceit. I was listening to a kind of a radio phone-in on this, and someone was saying, how dare Kate Forbes, she holds these views and she'd want to bring them into politics. How dare you have somebody who would want to do that? But of course, as was pointed out, everybody who goes into politics comes with their personal views that they want to implement. So those who are wanting to pursue a progressive liberal agenda, they are actually pursuing their personal beliefs. That's what drives them. That's what kind of motivates them. Politicians want to reflect in their policy what their deep convictions are. And to some extent, it's ironic, isn't it? We've talked about gender recognition. The whole idea that somebody can become a woman simply because they declare themselves to be a woman, that is in the end an act of faith and personal belief. That's a mystical conviction, not based on any kind of scientific or rational premise. That is simply a matter of personal belief that is then being enacted into legislation. So everybody in politics wants to ultimately bring their personal beliefs to bear. And at one level, would you want a politician who, in a sense, keeps a separation between what they really think and what they're prepared to do? Now, as Kate Forbes and Tim Farron and others have argued, there's a difference between sort of having my personal beliefs and then imposing those on others. And that's the essence of what kind of liberalism means within a kind of a plural, a democratic kind of context. So the difference between saying I've got strong convictions as a Christian, and I might want to even argue for those strong convictions in the public sphere, but that is quite different from saying I'm then going to impose them on others by legislation, unless that's supported by the democratic kind of majority.
Which you wouldn't be able to do that as the leader of the SNP. It's a ridiculous position. You can't just impose your one view and expect everybody else to follow that. Surely that's how democracy works, isn't it?
Well, you might think so, although I think you probably could make an argument that's how Nicola Sturgeon led the SNP. But I think it raises all kinds of questions, and I'm interested a lot in what are church members going to be saying on Sunday morning Well, there are all kinds of stories in the news. This is one of them. Are Christians going to basically be saying, there you go, this is proof that Christians are being persecuted in the UK? Is that right, John?
Yeah,
Christians are being persecuted? Is that the right language?
It's a really good question, because I've no designs on becoming the leader of the SNP, but it does make you think, well, could you just never hold office as a Christian?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, as you said, she's already been a Minister for Finance and has been allowed to serve in that role. Ian Blackford, who was the SNP's spokesman in kind of Westminster for a long period of time, was also a member of the Free Church of Scotland, personally holds to those same convictions, and they weren't attacked in the same way. We have to recognise that part of this is about a political argument about who's going to become leader of the SNP. And for those who want the SNP to be a progressive Liberal party, they will seize on these kinds of things as a way of trying to undermine a leadership campaign. So at one level, is this part and parcel of politics, or is this part and parcel of religious persecution? Is it any different from wanting to criticise Rishi Sunak because of his wealth and the wealth of his wife and her having a non-dom status? I don't think we should leap to think that this is religious kind of persecution directly. It's not the case that people are barred from exercising high political office because of their faith. Having said that, it is difficult, I think, for Christians to exercise kind of leadership of political parties because they have to support the positions of those political parties. And the issue here is really, what are the policies of the SNP, and will its leader reflect those policies? And it's a brute fact that in contemporary Britain, the vast majority of the population supports gay marriage. The vast majority of the population supports the provision of legal abortion and a woman's right to choose. And the convictions that Christians have on those issues are out of line with the vast majority of the population. And that inevitably means that it's going to, I think, be more difficult for Christians who hold strongly to those positions to be elected to office to serve, because it will be out of step with what party members and what the electorate more widely would want to pursue. So I think there is the challenge of being a Christian serving in a representative capacity in a cultural context in which the views that Christians hold are very different. And of course, 150 years ago, it would have been extraordinarily difficult for an atheist to get political office. It would have been exactly the other way round, because the democratic majority of the population would not have wanted an atheist to be exercising kind of political office. So I don't think we should think that it's religious
or
kind
a
of persecution or a nonconformist. Indeed, I do want to say it's really important. I think we should pay tribute to Kate Forbes.
I think she's
for
done
her
an
honesty.
amazing. Yeah, I totally agree.
I think she's been a wonderful example of a Christian engaging in the public sphere. She hasn't compromised. She hasn't been dishonest. She said what she kind of believes. She hasn't backpedaled in order to try to get office. I think she's been a wonderful witness to Christ and Christianity and the centrality of Christ in her life. She's also indicated her willingness as a Christian to want to serve the community as a whole. And I think when there are many Christians in public life or in work or in other contexts who are tempted to keep their heads down, basically because they don't want to attract attention, I think her willingness to answer questions honestly and straightforwardly is a wonderful example. And you might call it persecution, but you inevitably, when you do that, will attract opposition and people will disagree with you. That's not the same, I think, as an institutional persecution. But I think all credit to Kate Forbes, who set a wonderful example to Christians of faithful service and then being willing to be absolutely honest. And at one level, you get the feeling that actually she's more concerned to testify to Christ than to get the leadership. She is not prepared to do whatever it takes in order to get into that role of leadership. And I think that is an absolute model of what we want to see of Christians going into public service.
Yes. So which begs a second question for me that perhaps you would only ask north of the border at the moment, but let's say there's a general election. It might be a more general question. If you're a member of the SNP, or more generally if you're voting in an election, and one of the candidates is a Christian, right? A clear Christian like Kate Forbes, very clear about faith, evangelical, committed to the word of God, you'd automatically vote for them, wouldn't you? Is it the case that actually there are so few Christians around that whatever your political views, you ought to vote for the Christian? I'll only drink milk from a Christian cow, as you know, Steve Taylor once famously sung in the 80s. Is that right, John? So if I'm presented with a board of different options, different people to vote for, one of them's a Christian, bang, default vote.
Well, I don't think so, actually.
I would say,
so that's how lots of people think.
I agree with that. I agree with you, John.
But it seems to me that you're electing them to fulfill a set of promises that they've made in their manifestos. And the mere fact that a person is a Christian doesn't necessarily mean that they will be good in government or they'll do the right thing in government. So if you're in Scotland and you are a Christian, imagine that Kate Forbes was leader of the SNP. That doesn't mean you're necessarily going to vote SNP.
You might not want independence.
Strongly believe that independence would be bad for the long-term future of Scotland. So I don't think it's anywhere near as simplistic as that.
Well, I'm with you, but I think people do think about things simplistic like that. Actually, if I've got two doctors and I can go and see one who's a Christian, I'll go and see the Christian. If I'm voting, I might have particular views about politics, but actually, if there's one who's a Christian, that one's going to get my vote because they're so rare.
Although I'm not sure that comparison quite works. If you've got two doctors, you'd hope they're both equally competent and they're both trying to do the same thing. In the political sphere, you've got a whole other platform of policies that you're wanting to implement.
In that context, you're still thinking about the doctor's competence, not their faith. So you are drawing distinctions in the right place. I think the challenge is we see so few Christians in public life and doing Christian things that we're automatically drawn to Christians. It tugs at our heartstrings. We think, even if actually it's not the party I would normally have voted for, the doctor I would normally go and see. So I think actually we do need to understand common grace, don't we? We do need to understand that actually the Lord can also work through people who are not Christians and do a great job.
And it can be very complex because, for example, you might in your constituency have a good Christian candidate, and you know that because of the public mood, the votes, the polls, a particular party is going to win. You might decide actually having a representation of a good Christian in Parliament is actually more important at this point because actually that party's going to win anyway, but you want to make sure that somebody is going to be at least a voice for Christianity. So making those judgments when you vote, I think it can actually be really quite complicated.
Christian tactical voting, you heard it here first.
Well, there we are. It does link to something, though, Adrian, that you wanted to pick up about Nigeria. Just because you've got a Christian leader doesn't necessarily mean that things would be better for Christians in the nation where there's a Christian leader.
No, it doesn't. Nigeria is an important country. It's the largest country in Africa, has the largest economy in Africa. We've talked a lot about Eastern Europe because of Ukraine and what's going on in Ukraine. Obviously, that is significant. We've talked a lot about, or a little bit about Turkey and Syria following the earthquake. But a significant day tomorrow. Today is Friday. Tomorrow, which is, let me have a quick look, 25th. I should know that. It's almost my birthday. 25th of February, Saturday. Presidential elections in Nigeria. Really significant. Nigeria is a country that has huge influence in Africa, especially in that sort of part of sub-Saharan Africa and Northern Africa. But actually, Nigeria is a country that, because of emigration, has influence all around the world. Lots of us will be serving in churches alongside Nigerian brothers and sisters, or will know Nigerian Christians and who are in churches in the UK. And actually, really significant influence amongst all kinds of countries. I've done a preaching conference in Cameroon, which borders onto Nigeria, and there they talk about the influence that Nigeria has on them. So I think these presidential elections are very significant. And in Nigeria as a country is obviously some Christian, some Muslim. Largest number of Christians, I think, almost, apart from people who declare they're Christians, of any country in the world apart from America, something like that. 110 million, Christians. But actually, on the Open Doors World Watch list of persecution is number 6, which surprises some people. They've had a Christian president in the past. They've also had a Muslim president. And of course, that's largely because of what's going on in the north of Nigeria, where it's very, very difficult to be a Christian. And I was just reading this morning on the Open Doors website an extraordinary statistic that 90% of people killed for their faith last year were killed in Nigeria.
Wow.
So if the World Watch list that Open Doors produce, they say, was just based on violence alone, Nigeria would be number 1 by some distance. So it's an extraordinary thing, and we ought to pray for the elections. And I think there's an interesting thing going on. It's a very young country. So almost half of the voting population are under 35. And what's happening is there is a move towards a third candidate. Traditionally in Nigeria, there have been 2 parties. It looks like one party is going to win the election, the presidential election again. But there's a third candidate, kind of middle way, coming through that lots of the younger generation are flocking to. And it could have a significant impact, I think. It's because of the economy, because of the diaspora that there is, but also because of this persecution there is, especially by Boko Haram in the north, largely been energized by what's going on in Afghanistan. And I think, this Sunday we're going to be praying for the world in church. We're going to be praying for Ukraine. We're going to be praying for Syria and Turkey. We're also going to pray for Nigeria. That'd be a really good thing to do, wouldn't it? So there's no guarantee, I think, because you have a Christian leader, that makes everything okay. It's a very complex country, I understand that. And I think Christian leaders have had more integrity in Nigeria than some others who have gone before. But actually, it's no guarantee of success.
It's also worth saying we have to be careful to think through, what does a Christian mean? What does it mean to have a Christian leader? I mean, the last atheist leader in the UK, the last atheist prime minister was, I think, James Callaghan. So Margaret Thatcher would have talked about having a kind of a religious faith. Certainly Tony Blair, that was a very significant element of his kind of makeup. Gordon Brown, a kind of son of the manse. David Cameron would have talked about having
Didn't
a sort of Anglicanism.
It was like classic FM. Reception comes and goes.
That was
Magic
David
FM,
Cameron.
Magic FM,
Theresa May, regular churchgoer. Boris Johnson converted to Catholicism and had his children kind of baptised within Catholicism. Obviously, we now have a kind of Hindu prime minister. So, but what is a real kind of Christian? What's the difference between a kind of a superficial adherence to a sort of Christian culture and real faith? And at one level, I think one of the things that's come out of the issues in the sort of the SNP leadership is just a real lack of understanding of what Christianity is in the public sphere. Right. So the Free Church of Scotland has been kind of characterised as some extremist fundamentalist sect because of its convictions. But yet, actually, a belief that marriage is only to be between a man and a woman, a heterosexual relationship, that's the only proper context in which to have children, that abortion is wrong and is the killing of a child. Those are actually just historic Christian beliefs that were sort of held by the church, and that would be held by those that are evangelical believers who are committed to the Bible. They'd also be the convictions of the Roman Catholic Church around the world. So these are not...
And a lot of Christians in between, actually.
So the idea that somehow this is some extremist position represents a kind of a failure to recognise what Christianity is and what Christians kind of really believe. And at one level, the liberal media would want to give the impression that actually that's not the belief of Christians. But even the Church of England, for all of the failings of its kind of recent decision about blessing same-sex relationship, the Church of England has not chosen to perform same-sex kind of weddings. The orthodox doctrine of the Church of England on marriage is exactly the same as the Free Church of Scotland, that it's a sort of a heterosexual relationship between a man and a woman. So the established religion of the nation is the same as the position of the Free Church of Scotland. So to characterise it as some extreme position is just religiously illiterate.
And there's a lot of that going on, isn't it? I mean, I've heard of 2 instances in the last few weeks of churches being thrown out of schools in some way, Church of England schools in which they meet, because of their view on same-sex marriage or not allowing same-sex marriage.
Which coincidentally is the same view as the official view of the Church of England.
When they point that out to the schools in both cases, some surprise sort of registered back. Really, so I think even people within the system don't recognise. They sort of drink in the caricature and don't recognise this is mainstream teaching.
And of course, in Scotland, the Church of Scotland, which decided to perform same-sex marriages some time ago, the Church of Scotland is in catastrophic decline. Recent statistics over a 5-year period, they've shrunk by 29% in their attendance. They are a dying church. The irony is that the Free Church of Scotland, although it's smaller, is actually a growing church that is planting and seeing a growth and has some thriving congregations. So it is those churches that are remaining faithful to the Bible that are the growing churches.
Our friend David Meredith posted a lovely post, which was a list of Church of Scotland buildings up for sale, which at one level was very sad. But just to make the point, actually, this is not where the future is.
Go on.
And the irony is, in the SNP election, one of the other leading candidates, their health minister, is a Muslim by background, or at least identifies as a Muslim. But he's in favour of gay marriage and progressive kind of issues. You kind of say, I wonder whether the Muslim community would in any way recognise that as being a valid sort of Muslim position. The reality is that Islam is an incredibly conservative religion on issues of sexuality and kind of marriage, but yet it's accepted as if he is a Muslim candidate, despite the fact that his beliefs would be out of step with the vast majority of British Muslims and out of step with the vast majority of Muslims kind of around the world, which just shows that the liberal media is wanting to kind of force religion into its own kind of outlook and reshape the doctrines of religious faith to conform to their liberal outlook.
As a former journalist, I was furious with some of the sort of biblical illiteracy, Christian illiteracy that I've seen in some of the reports this week. It's just extraordinary, but I guess it's just what we expect, isn't it? Because there isn't that level of literacy in terms of the Christian faith. We talked about Nigeria. It's worth, you talked about praying for Nigeria on Sunday, Adrian. It's a great thing to do. Churches can do that, can't they? They can also pray on for Ukraine. The anniversary today of the invasion by Russia.
It will be clearer on Sunday, won't it, what exactly has happened. So there is talk about Russia launching a fresh invasion or a fresh initiative. They do love a date in Russia. Everything is sort of tied into dates and doing things on significant days. So we'll wait and see. It will be clearer on Sunday, but we need to go on praying for people in Ukraine, for believers caught up in this in all kinds of different places. Let's not forget believers in Russia who are marginalised because they're Christians and will often find life very difficult. Christians in Belarus who find life very difficult. So actually there's a lot to go on praying for. We mustn't let these things slip from our consciousness.
There's a moral question as well there, John, isn't there, about how much arms should be given to Ukraine to help them in this fight?
There is. I mean, it seems to me that this is a really significant conflict for the sake of Europe. What was thought to be a short war is suddenly going to come into a long-term war of attrition. Many commentators have made the point that sort of Putin's hope for winning is basically that the West gets fed up of supporting Ukraine. It seems to me that if Russian aggression is not going to be rewarded, then in the end there's no real option except for the West to continue to provide the arms that are needed to the people who are laying down their lives. There have been more than 20,000 Ukrainians have been killed defending their own country against this completely unwarranted aggression. What they need is the material means to be able to continue that fight. It's obviously a difficult balance because the West doesn't want to end up in a world war with Russia, but at the same time it wants to give the Ukrainians what is necessary for them to be able to defend their own home country. And I think the greatest chance of Putin winning is that the West becomes tired of supplying what is needed. War is always costly. The Ukrainians, if they were not being supported by the West financially and militarily, would have been rolled over and Ukraine would no longer exist. And if we want a world in which kind of invasions succeed, then do nothing. But it seems important that we don't allow the success of war and invasion kind of in Europe.
There's a perseverance there, isn't there? And a perseverance in prayer for us as Christians as well, to keep Ukraine and the people of Ukraine very much in our prayers. One more story to talk about before we draw to a conclusion. And we've talked about Kate Forbes, a Christian woman looking for the SNP leadership. But there's another Christian in the public eye who's passed away this week. John Motson, son of a Methodist minister, Christian man who was just loved by many up and down the country.
Soundtrack to my youth.
Yeah, well, that will be the case, I think, for a lot of people. Yeah. John Motson's football commentary is embedded in people's minds, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah, I think. And he was at Hillsborough, of course.
Yeah.
Famously, so not just football commentary, but actually commentating on very difficult things. He was also there in Hillsborough and gave evidence to the Hillsborough inquiry. And it's very striking. I mean, I love listening to John Motson. It really is the soundtrack of my youth, growing up. And he had a strong Christian faith. Didn't make a huge amount about it. I remember when I was first a pastor. I think during a World Cup it was a video then, Phil. You probably don't remember video cassettes, about the same size as this Bible. Used to put them in machines. But we had a video, I think called The Greater Goal or something like that, which was narrated by him, which was an evangelistic video, had clips of footballers talking about their faith. This is back in the I think it was recorded in the late 80s, early 90s. And then John Motson sort of talking about his faith. It's very moving. And he was a great supporter of Christians in sport. A keen churchgoer. He grew up in a Methodist family. You'll love this story, Phil. I thought this story was great. He was sent along to a Methodist boarding school. As a keen football supporter, his dad had been taking him to football every Saturday. And they didn't play football, they played rugby. And he got in trouble with the headmaster for putting out jumpers as goalposts. Can you believe it? You can't make it up, really.
That's great.
Jumpers as goalposts. And the headmaster called him in saying, we're doing the jumpers. And he shouldn't be doing that. They were a rugby playing school. But it didn't make him lose his love of football. And actually, here was someone who was really passionate about the subject. He wasn't just an employee who was commentating on football, although he did once, he commentated on all kinds of things, including Greco-Roman wrestling, to which I think Dickie Davis, I think it was someone like Dickie Davis or someone like that, who also passed away this week, said to him, don't worry, there's only 2 people who understand Greco-Roman wrestling in the UK, and neither of them will be watching. They'll be out rehearsing, so it doesn't matter. But he loved football, and he was speaking about something that he was passionate about, and that makes a real difference to commentary. John, you're not particularly a football fan, are you? But you can appreciate someone being passionate about something, speaking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually rather disappointed, Phil, you're not wearing your sheepskin coat in kind of tribute to that. I think that's
it's
kind
just
of
hanging on the hook over there.
would have. Yeah, I'm not a great fan of football, but actually I always enjoyed listening to him. He engaged you, and I think actually it was a combination of he was informative, he explained what was going on, his enthusiasm was kind of infectious. I picked up on a couple of things. There was a tribute to him kind of on the radio that I happened to be listening to, and it sort of the 2 big things were his expertise, that he absolutely knew sort of about the sport. Absolutely. He did all his work, did his research, so he was able to kind of tell you when this had last happened in a sort of a game. If these are in days before having computers and those
no
days,
Google,
and great teams of researchers.
He was absolutely on top of his material and thoroughly prepared, and in a sense, all that preparation enabled him to comment on individual games. He didn't use it all in every individual game, but all that background of information and hard work made his commentary accurate, helpful, but also he was described as being a commentator for the fans. Yeah. So rather than sitting somehow objectively distant from it, basically he commentated in a way that was, and it was described as being kind of like being next door to your mate at the game.
Absolutely.
In the way that he communicated. And I was just struck by, I think, both of those things actually have real parallels with how we preach, minister of the Bible. It seems to me that actually the task of being a commentator, a sports commentator, who helps others to engage in the action, well, actually, particularly maybe if you're on the radio, you're not there watching yourself, but you're actually helping somebody to kind of
are their eyes.
Enter into
absolutely.
it. You are their eyes.
Yeah.
That work is exactly what we do when we take God's word and we enable the congregation and others to hear it. And that combination of a depth of expertise and knowledge that we can bring to bear on the word, but particularly speaking as a fan to fans, not sort of objectively distant, but as believers ourselves who are gripped by this, who love it, and who want to convey that to other people. That's absolutely what we should be aiming for.
We should have an excitement for the gospel every time we preach, shouldn't we? And that should really come through in the way we deliver it. I mean, people talk about having a Motti moment, if I can put it like that. That was going around on Twitter yesterday. And I know what mine is. It was back in '94. Bolton were playing at Arsenal. Sorry, Adrian. And at the time, Bolton were rubbish, like they are now. And Arsenal were right up there towards the top of the Premier League. Yeah, exactly. And essentially, it was a giant killing. And Bolton were 2-1 up, and one of our players, Andy Walker, gets the ball on the edge of the box, and I still remember the commentary. Motson goes, "Walker for Bolton," and he goes, "Yes," and he celebrates the goal as it hits the net. Surely that must be it. And everyone's got a Motti moment, but it's just that enthusiasm for his material. I think that's really important.
I mean, sometimes he was very measured.
Yeah, when he had to be.
And I think again, there's a lesson there for preaching, isn't there? That he was measured and impartial. But actually, every now and again, the emotion shone through, and you realise this really means something to him. And anyway, his with Christ, which is better by far, and I think that's the greatest thing of all, isn't it? That actually his Christian faith means something, counts for something. And will there be the beautiful game in the new creation?
I can't possibly give a theological answer
podcast.
to that question. John, Adrian, thanks so much for talking about the news stories of this last couple of weeks. This has been Independence, the FIEC podcast. Do rate, leave a review, share it so others can find it, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.